I Was a Teenage Exocolonist is a game from Northway Games that came out in 2022, a year when I am more and more feeling like media production did something weird to affect me, personally, deliberately. It launched on basically everything, including Mac OS and Linux, which speaks to a desire to include people in this big, sprawling game that Wikipedia calls an RPG, that the Steam copy calls a narrative RPG, which I keep thinking of as a dating sim. In this game, you're going to play as a character that starts out as a 10-year-old on a colony ship, which then lands and explores the story of a human colony on this alien world for the first time in history. You follow the character across a sequence of years, confronting challenges, learning about who you are and who you want to be, developing experiences with other people, which you will save and slot into a deck of cards you then use to overcome challenges later. This is a game I find incredibly exciting, and I like playing it, and I like enjoying the experiences it offers me, and that's great. Especially if you know me and my personal challenges grappling with playing and enjoying visual novels. When I say it's a visual novel or a dating sim, I want to do that in a way that properly puts respect on the term. Because I think it's very reasonable to describe I Was a Teenage Exocolonist as being in the same genre as Roommates, in the same way that Wolfenstein 3D and Battlefield 2042 are games in the same genre. There's a lot of fundamental ideas that are lined up, but one of them has access to a lot more different ways to express their ideas. There's a preemptive sneer in the critical space around visual novels and dating sims. When Doki Doki Literature Club was the topic, there were a lot of people, like me, who don't play many games in the genre, talking about one game that was doing something remarkable that they hadn't seen before, and used that to suggest that this game elevated the form. I found this discourse tiresome because the game didn't really do anything that surprised me, which was, I think, a byproduct of my being aware that it wasn't doing anything new in the genre. That whole period made me cautious about talking too decisively, too seriously, about what the game genre does or has in it, because what I'm mostly aware of is the things I don't know about. Aha, people muse. What about these interesting ideas of a game that tells you it doesn't want to play with you? Isn't that interesting? Isn't that something new? All while ignoring that the game is very much not doing that, and also that this is something games have been doing for decades in that genre. I'm not saying I'm a better critic than people who were impressed by Doki Doki Literature Club, mind you. I mean, maybe a little. Point is that it's very possible to describe I Was a Teenage Exocolonist as a visual novel and dating sim and have that feel like I'm presenting it in the wrong way. I could just as much try and call it a deck builder, or a life simulator, or yes, a role-playing game, and those wouldn't be wrong ways to describe it otherwise. Thing is, why not describe it as a dating sim? It's a game where the mechanics of romances and relationships are front and center, with room for players to explore them, and it seems to me that they're as important as any amount of shooting Geth is to Mass Effect. If you want to define dating sim and visual novel down to the point where this game can't be included, you're kind of paring down what those genres can even be in a way that's deliberately designed to exclude almost every form of those games that doesn't fit into a very narrow band. Basically, it's saying, these things are boring because anything that isn't boring isn't one of them, definitionally. And if you know me, you know how much I don't tend to buy definitional arguments when it comes to game experiences. So, I Was a Teenage Exocolonist is a dating sim. It's a really, really good one. It's a visual novel. It's a really, really long one. I am not a big reader, as may surprise those of you who see the amount of words I put out or the books I have to engage with for my study. I do not, typically speaking, like reading a lot, and it's partly because I need to do a lot of reading. My reading is compulsory and it's slow and it's difficult. When I don't have to read, not books at least, I do kind of try to do that instead for my leisure time. There's a lot of reading in I Was a Teenage Exocolonist. It is, honestly, so vast a reading task that I do not feel confident, a mere 24 hours of playing through the game later, being prepared to say what is or is not in the text. I can't say that there's not some plot spur or some specific idea that I personally wouldn't like, because there's just so much of it. And what's more, as a game, any given playthrough is going to show you just one particular version of it. A text where there are multiple versions that you're expected to experience in multiple different iterations is a hypertext. Some pre-digital hypertexts include things like ambigrams, sentences that change meaning when read backwards, or mystery novels. It's not a new thing, it's just a thing we needed terms for when we started talking about video games, and then realized that, once again, video games were connected to a longer, greater culture of engagement with art. Point is that I Was a Teenage Exocolonist is an extremely hypertextual game. It's full of different choices and ways to engage with its problems, and I think it shaped my experience of the game trying to imagine what it might be doing or might be about to do. I thought it was really interesting, and I didn't want to just list it to you, hey, here's stuff I cared about in this game, in a way that meant when you played the game, because I think odds are good you will like this game. Part of what I liked about I Was a Teenage Exocolonist experience was that the way the game I engaged with in the beginning wound up presenting totally reasonable changes to my expectations. Basically, stuff I thought I'd care about in 10 years, when I was 10, I did not care about in the same way. My relationships were shaped by randomness and circumstance, and I wound up feeling entangled in a story in a way I wouldn't have chosen to be. This enmeshing is really interesting, and I know when I loop back through this story, I'm going to do it without these changes being unexpected. It's going to change how I relate to things in this game, and for that reason, I kind of don't want to show you too much about what's in the game. Hence this video being full of slow pans across promotional art and, me. But I don't want this to come across as a sort of token effort of a video. I don't want you to look at this and come away with, wow, I Was a Teenage Exocolonist is a big game and Talon hasn't played all of it yet because that would take ages and he likes it. What I want to talk about instead, and what I keep thinking about as I play I Was a Teenage Exocolonist, is the work of one Roger Caillois. Roger Caillois, or Roger Caillois for those of you who've only ever read his name rather than heard it said aloud, was a French intellectual whose career started out before World War II and kept on publishing until he died in 1978, and then, because he was influential and wrote a bunch of stuff that's still being translated and published, kept publishing until 2006, which is a pretty good running for a dead guy. If you want to frame him as positively as possible, Caillois was a part of an academic tradition that sought to involve as many different people as possible from as many different places, and founded the academic journal Southern Cross, which helped introduce authors like Jorge Luis Borges and Victoria Ocampo to French-speaking audiences. If you want to be a little less charitable, he was an advocate for Western oppressive and exploitative colonialism as a necessary good to correct the failings of all other cultures that existed at a level of civilizational quality below the level of white Western Europeans. What can one say, of course, but yikes. I could spend a lot of time talking about different criticisms of Caillois, from the funny, he hated clowns, to the vague, he was very good at intellectualizing what he was ultimately only his personal experience and generalizing that out to a rule, to the deeply damaging, he didn't respect women or non-white people at all. But instead I want to talk about one of his most well-known contributions to academic culture, with the proper framing up front so you know full well that these ideas did come from someone who needs to be considered with a degree of scrutiny. He's responsible for the book Man, Play and Games, which is probably his most influential work. In Man, Play and Games, Caillois describes a lot of ideas. He talks about the idea of culture's destiny reflected in their games, and about the distinction between types of play as expressive or rules-structured, a paradigm of ludic play versus paidic play. Then, he describes a model of game classification for considering different games not based on the components that are in them, or their length or size or form or outcomes, but instead about what experience motivates people to play them. And I want to talk about this model because I think it can be a great way to look at I Was a Teenage Exocolonist, a game that can offer you everything. First up, the summary. Caillois considers games to be broken into 4 basic motivating factors, reasons people play them, things that they play them for. They are agon, alia, ilinx, and mimicry. Agon refers to competitive overcoming of obstacles. Agonic games are games where difficulty are important, games where you're meant to be able to test your skill. You might recognize good examples of agonic games, such as the Indian game Chaturanga, or the Japanese game Go, games with a lot of open information and correct forms of play building around strategic windows. You might recognize it, but Caillois didn't, because he didn't think Asian games produced meaningful examples of agonic play. Alia refers to games of chance, where your best choices are going to be considered to the winds of fate. Caillois liked to connect this to his existing ideas of the sacred and divine, like there's some part of people that just wants to give up offerings. But we don't need that here, not really. I just think Aliatic games are games where a player's need to random, chance-based elements because they are looking for the feeling of getting lucky. Ilinx refers to games of vertigo, of the voluptuous panic of a loss of control of the senses. This is games where you're losing the ability to perceive and experience things correctly. If you're having a hard time thinking of games of Ilinx, then think about things you see little kids doing. Spinning on the spot, rolling down hills, swinging on ropes. Or maybe that's just monkeys. Caillois argued that adult games of Ilinx didn't exist until the invention of the roller coaster. I argue This means nobody invited Caillois to any really good parties. Drinking games, playing video games while stoned, these are iLinks experiences, and you play in part to enjoy that experience of not being in control of your experiences and perception. Then there's mimicry, which refers to games about being or pretending to be another person, or another thing. These are games of simulation, of recreated experiences, which you may recognize from almost every video game you've ever played in the past 20 years. Since these days, it's very common for video games to include some kind of character for you to inhabit as an agent. But most keenly, you'll see this stuff in play experiences, like role-playing games and life simulators. Then, there's a secret fifth thing. Now, Caillois believed that games were fundamentally games of these traits. Chess is an agonic game because it's played for a winner and a loser with open information and people are trying to get better at it. If you're not doing that, you're not playing chess. Which portrays one of the ways Caillois' thinking was kind of bent at odd angles to mine. I don't think games are agonic. I think you play games in agonic ways. There are absolutely people who play chess in ways that aren't agonic. They're thinking about some other way to play. They're looking at rule systems and aiming for a particular vibe, a joke to pull, or whatever. Chess is not agonic. It's just we culturally assert that chess should be treated as if it is only agonic. And that's the distinction, that you can use these tools to experience games in different ways. And that brings me to I Was a Teenage Exocolonist. I Was a Teenage Exocolonist is a game of Agon. There's a lot of reading to do, but it's beating hard as a resolution system that operates as a good faith puzzle game where you spend time getting yourself the best puzzle pieces that are meant to function together in as optimal a way as you can. Your cards are known to you. You can refine them with currency, and you can amplify them with stats you build up through carefully chosen processes. The game pieces are not random and do not ask of you to guess what they do in any given interaction. If you want to, you can math out layers upon layers of game strategy, and optimal play involves correct routing and correct execution. It can even be unlocked into harder mode, so there's a need to do this to push through the game's challenges. While losing isn't the end of the story, you can always approach problems with the mindset that this is somehow winnable. It competes with you, it defies you, and it keeps escalating and demands that you escalate with it. And then, when you feel like you've failed, you can loop back through and do it all again, harder and armed with more knowledge. I Was a Teenage Exocolonist is a game of Alia. There is a constant presence of gambling in the game, where sometimes all you can do is consign your fate to the cards presented to you. You are going to accumulate cards, if you don't try and stop it, and that means you're going to wind up over the course of the story naturally building up a collection of memories that are at the very least unreliable or weird or don't fit together well. And the ways to approach and experience as much of the game as possible means you're going to wind up believing in the heart of the cards and stacking a lot of L's when they don't come through for you. This is setting aside the social elements of the game too. There are a lot of things that have a chance to just go wrong because the game is unpredictable in a lot of deliberate ways. Keeps you on your toes. You need to capitalize on random respawns and lucky encounters because you won't always get the best version of things you want. You need to be at least a little bit lucky. I Was a Teenage Exocolonist is a game of iLinks. Sure, the game doesn't reach in through your USB port and get you high, and there's no playing with proprioception that you might get from a VR game, or try to scramble your brains through non-sexual sissy hypno like 1995's Zoop. What do you mean I'm the only person who remembers Zoop? But the character you play is constantly being thrown through a series of experiences that are about a sudden and panicking loss of control. The helplessness of being a child in a truly alien space aside, there are numerous encounters in the story that are about an immediate and wholehearted loss of control over your own body regardless of what the rules say. And your character does kind of get high a few times as their consciousness is expanded by the actions of others. This is a really interesting thing to consider because the game's only recourse to make you experience this iLinks is not to deprive you of agency or information, but to instead instill in you what it feels like to feel this way, with metaphor and simile. I Was a Teenage Exocolonist is a game of mimicry. It's a life simulator game where you get to settle into the identity of this kiddo in space who is going to go through the weirdest thing in their life so far. You're going to choose what they prioritize, who they prioritize, what they do with their limited time as a child, and what those priorities mean for you. Are you a planner? Do you have set goals? Or do you just handle what comes your way? How well do you stick to the plan if you have one? Do you think you can stick to it even when confronted with an ugly, unpleasant choice? What and who and how do you care about these things? Not just the character, but you as that character. What's that? Why, that's Astrid Enslun's music! Yeah, so the history of game studies is a lot of white dudes in privileged positions deciding that, hey, games are pretty much like this and not connected to anything else. And then women, queers, and people of colour, and queer women of colour, show up afterwards and say, hey, no, actually, people's material conditions do matter here. In Caillois' model, he conceived of these 4 reasons people might engage with a game, but that is missing a category that Ensslin describes in literary gaming: Rhythmos. Rhythmos is engaging with a game because of the pure intersection of its rules as systems. It's the kind of people who find the way that game behaviour all slots together neatly satisfying. The people who like finishing their turns with no leftover points, or pare a speedrun down to its minimum frames. Rhythmos is the play experience of liking the interaction of rules in interlocking systems for their own beneficial form. Rhythmos is using all 8 letters on your first turn in Scrabble, and it is ghost running a Dishonored level without using any stun darts. Rhythmos cares about the things that can be done in the rules and the ways those executions can be done perfectly. And I Was a Teenage Exocolonist is a game of Rhythmos because of just how everything in its vast, sprawling spread of interactions beckons to you with the idea of a perfect run. You can tell there are choices to be made, you can see there are places you waste investment and overflow, and if you can just talk to everyone in the right order, you can approach this system in the right way, map out the right direction next time, you should be able to unlock all these things and hit this goal and successfully make the whole thing fit together like a puzzle box of numbers. Thing is, I Was a Teenage Exocolonist has a lot of different reasons to want to engage with it. You can approach it in a lot of different ways. Some of those are going to be incredibly engaging. I know I found it got its hooks into me hard, and I had to literally assign myself homework with a post-it note on my desk to make sure I didn't just open it up and vaporize a second day. And there's something else that's covertly missing from I Was a Teenage Exocolonist. See, growing up, you are going to have decisions about yourself, about your priorities that you're going to make, and things that are going to change. You might find, like I did, at some point that one of the people you assume is just as good as everyone else needs to get hit with a brick. Something that I Was a Teenage Exocolonist has space for and doesn't do is grapple with your own sexuality or gender too. At any point in I Was a Teenage Exocolonist, you can decide you want to try out some new pronouns, a new appearance, just pivot your slider over to the side and things are different now. It's interesting because it's a reminder that for all there are things about your character that are a little bit defined, bumpers you bounce against on the way to your end of the story, there are also details that the game leaves entirely up to you to express. You get to choose if that's a thing you want your exocolonist to do during the story. There's a room for where you play, where there are rules, but there is also a space for individual expression. It's this space that Caillois, who died shortly after the first video games were being made, describes. This latitude of the player, this margin accorded to his actions, is essential to the game and partly explains the pleasure which it excites. It is equally accountable for the remarkable and meaningful uses of the word play, such as are reflected in such expressions as the playing of a performer or the play of a gear, to designate in one case the personal style of an interpreter, in the other the range of movement of the parts of a machine. I Was a Teenage Exocolonist is an amazing game, and it wants you to play with it. Also, in one of the appendices to his book, Caillois describes that if everything in the world is best determined by games that are both competitive and a little bit random, then clearly the only way society should be organized is a system that gives everyone an equal and fair start so they have the chance to optimally play the games of their lives without fear of things like hunger or homelessness, and therefore the only way forward was full luxury space gay communism. Which is a pretty wild thing coming from someone who was just as bigoted as him.